I've done that a couple times. Okay. So I'm Barry McWilliams. I'm the Zoom host for the Seattle Storytellers Guild, and I'm going to be the MC tonight for our program. We have two very fine Northwestern tellers who I've heard tell scary stories, and I tell you, they usually leave you kind of shaking in your seats. Um, I heard Sarah at Folklife a couple of years back, and I've said, boy, she's quite a teller. And Larry, I mean, we all know that the only person that scares Larry is Pat Peterson, and she's in the audience. So he better be a little bit nervous as he tells his tales. But anyway, from time to time, it's been a custom to use a land announcement. Um, and there's some discussion about how appropriate these are, whether it's just giving lip service to Native Americans that live in the area or whether we really care about them. So I'm going to do a little bit of a announcement here, and it's not just giving lip service in a sense, but I will mention some of the concerns they have. But I don't think we all need to rush out and deal with some of these things. But in times past, the First Nation Salish peoples who dwelt in this land would gather in cedar plank houses on the rocky shores between the steep mountains and the deep valleys of the Pacific Northwest with their forests of spruce and fir or cedar, and the foggy, misty, rocky islands and shores of the northwest coast. In the wintertime, they usually were in the houses right along the shoreline, not up the rivers. The rivers would tend to overflow and flood a lot in the wintertime. They would gather to potlatch, to sing and dance and tell stories around their fires, their songs, their stories, their carvings, their ceremonies, all passed down their culture to future generations, cautioning them to show respect for the land upon which they live. We have to acknowledge that where these stories are coming from are neighbors in these Salish homelands, and our forebears did treat these indigenous peoples and their cultures with great disrespect. We're still a long ways from reconciliation with the land and with the nations with whom we share it. The Salish Sea, its rivers and forests need our joint stewardship. You see that again and again in the news and the papers. And even now we should grieve with the Lummies at the passing of Nokate and rejoice of the return of the salmon to the Elwha. We should be aware of the effects of rising seas and climate change on the Quinault and other tribes along the coast. Share in the struggle for recognition of the Duwamish and show our concern for the poverty, drugs, and lack of opportunity for the youth of the Yakama Nation. Now, they've told stories around their fires of their origins, their clan ancestors, and they offered thanks for the land's bounty of resources, their cedar and salmon in particular. They told stories of raven and coyote and other shape-shifting spirit beings and their mischievous ways. And they told a lot of spooky tales of shamans and ghosts, of cannibal giant and basket woman, great whirlpool maker and devilfish. And like them, tonight we're gathering together in this Zoom longhouse to shiver and laugh together over some scary stories and hopefully some more humorous ones as well. As we do this, we're welcoming two storytellers to our midst. One is Larry Hohm. Larry, say something.
Hello and welcome all. Thank you for coming out to listen.
Okay, and the other one is Sarah Comer, and I'm adding her spotlight, and she can say something as well.
Thank you all for coming out. Really excited to get to tell stories and get to hear stories from Larry too.
Yeah, as we, I assume my tellers are basically going to do their program. Larry, are you telling first and then Sarah? Or do you have
That's
the other way
fine.
around.
the other way around? Sarah goes first? Okay, so let me introduce Sarah, a little bit about her. Um, Sarah lives in Puyallup, and you can always tell if somebody lives in the Northwest or not, because if they don't know how to pronounce the town she lives in. But she is a fiddle teacher, a folk arts facilitator, I should say, and a Pacific Northwest storyteller. She's quite a fiddler. That if you go to her website, you can hear her play. But she was really fortunate to learn from the previous generations of old time fiddlers who passed on their fiddling like the Indians passed on their tales, and is proud to carry that music on. She's had audiences at Northwest Folklife and even in Benaroya Hall. She recreates the music of the 1800s for living history museums, and in recent history, in 2014, she was listed in the top 10 best local musicians for Evening Magazine. That's quite an honor right there. As a folk art facilitator, she teaches dance, folk dancing, and is helping people to take a step away from their smartphones and towards their neighbors. But tonight, as a gifted storyteller, she's going to bring life to some of the old tales. Now, she's told tales at the annual Bonfires, Beaver Pelts, and Boogeyman Halloween storytelling events, Pioneer Days, and recently she had a one-woman show telling stories, where she explored common themes in folk tales and the ways storytelling has changed. So tonight we want to welcome to our midst Sarah Comer. Looking forward to hopefully seeing more of her. But as she comes, let's just give her a nice little silent clap as we welcome her to our stage. Sarah, it's yours.
Well, thank you very much for that lovely introduction, and thank you to the Seattle Storytellers Guild for hosting this wonderful evening, and to all of you for coming out here. One of the things that I love about storytelling is the way that we're all about to hear the same story at the same exact moment, and yet we're going to have radically different experiences together. So, for instance, if I were to tell you a story about this spooky haunted house and how every evening, just as the sun was going down, the most beautiful bird you'd ever seen would fly down and land on the windowsill. And it would sit there singing its little heart out in an eerie contrast to that dark, haunted feeling that oozed out from that house. Now, look even a little closer still and tell me, what color is that bird in your mind? And is the house a haunted two-story decaying Victorian, or maybe a moss and mold covered 1960s Rambler? It doesn't matter. It's the right house and the right bird for you, because there's as many birds and houses as there are heads in this Zoom room. And that's exactly as it should be. So when I say contrary, is there someone in your life that comes to mind, someone who would commit to tomato purely because you'd said tomato, someone who just had to be on the opposite side of everything? Can you have them in mind? Well, good, because Timothy was just like them, only about 12 years old and a little scabby about the knees. His full name was Timothy Cornelius Blunt. But when his mother was tired to the point of honesty, she'd sometimes get thinking that maybe that C really ought to have stood for contrary, because it seemed that there was not a single thought in that boy's head that wasn't driven by just opposing somebody else. If she'd encourage him to hurry up and come to dinner before his soup got cold, well, he'd move like a sloth and declare that cold soup was best anyway. And if his mother saw him starting to get a little overheated playing outside and encourage him to maybe go off in the shade for a little while, that boy would resolutely rather sizzle like bacon in the sun rather than yield to someone else's suggestion. And so, of course, one morning when she told him today seemed like a good day for staying home, there was a storm blowing in. Well, he decided he was going fishing, and no force on earth was going to stop him. The fish weren't biting, but when he started making his way home, that storm was indeed coming. It started as a fine mist, and the mist became drops, and the drops became sheets as the west wind began to blow, and pretty soon he was soaked through and could hardly see where he was going. But he could see off in the distance there a little light from a strange house, and his mother had told him not to talk to strangers, so off he went to the house as quick as he could. He knocked on the door, and when nobody answered, opened it and saw that there was nobody there, but there was a bright fire burning in the fireplace and a really comfy-looking chair beside it. So he sat down and made himself at home. But then he saw there was a black cat staring up at him from the hearthstones, and there was something kind of disapproving in the black cat's expression. But being a cat, it quickly lost interest in him and went to lay down in the middle of the fire. And he tried to tell himself that wasn't so. It must be a trick of the light. But no matter how he looked, the flames came up all around that cat. Now, I would hope if you or I found ourselves in such a situation, we would be seeing this as a red flag, yes? But I wonder how many stories Timothy listened to growing up. He didn't seem to think much of it. He just settled back in his chair, and as the warmth of the fire overcame him, he started falling asleep until there came a knock at the door. He hurried over, took hold of the knob, looked out, and didn't see anyone there, until he felt something push past his knee, a black cat, even bigger than the first one, with shining yellow eyes.
What's this one doing here?
It asked. And the first cat replied to it.
I don't know. Just let himself in, easy as you please. Well, said the second cat, let's just wait till Martin comes. He'll know what to do with him.
And then that second cat went to where the first lay and began washing its face in the coals. Now again, this would seem a situation one ought to leave, but it was still raining, and Timothy was still contrary, and so he settled himself back in the chair and began again to nod off. And then there was again a knock at the door. He was a little slower to the knob this time and opened it a little more carefully to reveal another black cat, this one the size of a mule, black as tar.
What's he doing here? It asked. We don't know, but we're going to wait till Martin comes. He always knows what to do with them.
Well, at this, that third and biggest black cat turned and looked at Timothy.
You'd best leave now, little mouse, if you know what's good for you.
Well, how do you suppose Timothy, contrary, blunt, responded to that? Oh, I like it here. I'm going to stay. Timothy lied. Oh, he didn't like it there at all, but he certainly wasn't going to yield. So he sat himself in that chair, getting more and more frightened by the moment, waiting for the inevitable knock. But there was no knock. No, a great pounding at the door. Shaking hands, he took hold of the knob, opened, afraid to look. But there was nothing. Nothing at all, just the inky black sky and the yellow moon. Or so he thought, until the moon winked at him, for it was not the moon, but the eye of the greatest cat yet. It squeezed through the door, one great paw after the other, nearly filling the room with its great hairy body.
What's he doing here?
And the three cats in tandem called back,
We don't know, but let's wait.
Oh, but Timothy didn't let them finish. Tell Martin I couldn't wait, he said, and ran out the door, ran all the way home, ran all the way back to his mother, never to be quite so contrary again. Thank you. Well, makes me think of another story. Did you ever meet two people and just think to yourself, why, they were just made for each other? Well, that's what everyone thought when they met John and Mary Rowan. What a pair. Mary was clever and smart, so funny. And John, what a wonderful, kind, sweet man. Why, if he had any fault at all, it was maybe just that he never thought ill of anybody, no matter how good a reason he had. But, well, the good thing about that was Mary had natural suspicion against her fellow man, enough for 2, maybe 3 people. So between the 2 of them, it sort of balanced out. And it was a good thing, too, because, well, of that man that John met in the field one day. He was out there working away when he looked up, and all of a sudden, there's a man standing there. Didn't hear him coming, didn't see him coming, and that was strange. It was strange everything about this man, really. He was dressed in a 3-piece black wool suit and hat. It was awfully fancy for a field, John thought, and awfully hot for the middle of summer, but John was a live and let live sort of fellow, so he just said, "Well, hello." "Hello to you, John Rowan," the man said. "It's an awfully nice farm you have here, and there's nothing I'd like more than to come and work with you." "Well, I'd love that too," said John, "but I don't have the money for a hired hand." "Oh, no matter," the man said. "If you'll let me live with you, why, I'll stay just as long as you have use for me." Well, John thought that sounded pretty good, so he brought the stranger on home to meet Mary. And Mary was suspicious. First of all, she knew nobody's going to give you something for nothing. And she grew even more suspicious looking him over. Who could come all the way out to their farm on dirt roads in a black suit and not have a speck of dust on him? She reached the peak of Mount Suspicion when she found out that the man refused to remove his hat or boots at any time. Well, he even slept with them on. She tried to tell this to John, but John just thought, well, everybody's a little eccentric. No problem. Well, Mary decided she was going to keep a real close eye on this stranger. So the next day, when John asked him to go out and shear the sheep, Mary noticed the man didn't take any shears with him. Well, who shears sheep with no shears? So she followed around behind him, sneaking around, hiding behind a rock to watch while he went to work. The man put the fingers to his lips, and out came a high, lonesome sort of whistle. And in came all the sheep, kind of stunned and glassy-eyed, hypnotized, all gathering into a tight little ball. The man raised his arms, and up came a great gust of wind, so great for a moment Mary had to shut her eyes. And when she looked again, there was a great mountain of wool on one side and a bunch of naked sheep shivering over on the other. Well, that, she decided, ain't natural. So she hurried home, tried to tell John, but all he said was, "Oh, now, Mary, what's it matter how our new friend shears the sheep so long as he does it?" So Mary had to move to phase 2 of her plan. That night, when everyone was asleep, she snuck in to the spare room and took hold of that black hat on the man's head and slid it off. And what do you suppose she saw but 2 little horns sticking out the top of his head? Well, she ran off, got John. "John, we've got the devil in our house," she said, pointing at it. And John goes, "Oh, now, Mary. Now, he's probably just had a little bump on the head." Oh, Mary was on her last straw. She took hold of the man's boot and pulled, and off it come. And what do you suppose she saw where there ought to be human toes but a little cloven hoof? John, now do you believe me?" "Oh, now, Mary, maybe he just had a little accident." Oh, Mary's eye was starting to twitch something fierce, but she took hold of that other boot. She tugged and pulled, and off it come. And there was a second cloven hoof, just like the first. "Twice, John? Twice you think he had an accident?" Well, she yelled loud enough to wake the devil up, but she wasted no time. She looked him right in his little beady devil eyes and said, "Are you the devil, sir?" "I am," he said, bowing low. Well, John was shocked. "What? Oh, it can't be. Well, then you gotta get." "Oh, I can't be doing that now, John Rowan. I made a promise. I promised that I would stay just as long as you had use for me. And man has always found use for me." Oh, John was in a panic. He was trying everything he could come up with some kind of task the devil couldn't do for him. So he thought real hard. He sent the devil out to the field to count every little piece of grain. But this the devil did in no time at all. He's very good at math, you know. Well, he thought, well, what about carrying water in a sieve? He told the devil, go carry me water in a sieve. But the devil just called up all the teeny tiniest little demons of his domain, and each one stuck a bony finger in the holes until the whole thing was watertight. Well, John just fell down in despair, and Mary figured it was her turn to go to bat with the devil. Here, devil, she said, pulling one curly red hair off of her head. Straighten this for me. With pleasure, the devil said. He took it between his fingernails and pulled. Sprung back just the way it was. He took it through his pointed devil teeth. Sprung back and poked him in the eye. So he took it over to an anvil where he pounded on it day and night, night and day, but all to no avail. It was curly as it ever was the moment it sprung from Mary's head. Well, devil, she said, you're no use to me or my husband. So you've got to go. And he did. Devil left, and Devil never bothered John or Mary Rowan again. But the next time that Mary got a mite suspicious of somebody, old John Rowan, he took a notice. Thank you. Well, it is Halloween, or nearly, and time for stories of graveyards. Why, there was one spectacular graveyard, St. Timothy's Cemetery it was. And they had to find a new caretaker after old Mr. Robertson disappeared. Some said he went mad. Others that he came into a huge sum of money and went off to live like a king somewhere exotic and warm. But behind closed doors, there were those that silently speculated that it was the rats. Ah, yes, the rats of St. Timothy's were legendary, often 18 inches long, exclusive of their wriggling, wormy tails. They were devilishly smart, and many supposed that their intelligence was derived from none other than the Dark Prince himself. Oh, but then there were also their tunnels. Massive things, periodically visible when new graves were being dug, and they were more than large enough to facilitate Robertson's disappearance. But not everyone believed those stories. No, Joseph Masson, he wasn't into superstition. All he wanted was the opportunity to make money, and so he took the job. But he soon discovered that, supernatural or no, these were no ordinary rats. Nothing he did put even the smallest dent in their numbers. Poison went uneaten, traps came back broken, and the cats he sent out didn't come back at all. He hated those rats, not just for all the trouble they caused him, but because they were bad for business. You see, the finest of gold is used in filling teeth, and many people wear their finest suit of clothes to the grave, perhaps even precious jewelry. And Mr. Masson had realized that the pay of a grave digger and cemetery keeper was certainly not enough for him to live as he would like. But as a dealer in second-hand clothing and jewels, he did rather well for himself. And when the rich did not oblige him with their possessions, the poor made up the difference with their bodies. For there were always young medical students looking for a fresh canvas on which to ply their trade, and through these many employments, John Masson lived very well indeed. But the rats, those unholy rats, were always beating him to his prize. Many a time he dug through the night to unearth a freshly buried body and its possessions, only to find they'd got there first, dragged the body off for a subterranean feast. But he would not be beaten tonight. Just that day, he'd buried a very rich old woman with a very large diamond set in a brooch, and he wanted it, desired it, and after an hour of digging in the rain, why, he convinced himself he deserved it. He was not going to have the rats running off with it. When the shovel finally hit the coffin top, Mashin shrieked in delight. He worked at the lid with a pry bar, finally flinging it aside to find the coffin was empty again. But then he saw something moving off on the far end. He took up his lantern, leaned low, and he could see the whole top of the coffin had been gnawed away. And through that gap, through the darkness, 2 shoes were going farther and farther away. The body carried off, down through the malodorous tunnels and into the labyrinthian world of the rats, taking the diamond with it. "And no, you don't," he called, and with the lantern in one hand began to crawl after the body. Up ahead, he could see the cat-sized rodents dragging their prey. Their eyes flashed green and their teeth shone orange in the lantern light. He plunged madly onward after them as their brothers hissed and squealed from the side tunnels. Well, with all of this crying and squeaking, it's funny that that's not what caught his attention, not what brought him out of the madness. No, it wasn't the squeals, but the soft thud of damp earth that brought him back. For you see, the tunnel was beginning to cave in around him, and worse still, his place in it was now so tight that he couldn't turn around. As he watched, the body in front of him was sucked down a side tunnel, and the rats not invited to join the feast, while those that remained turned their attention to him. He began to frantically back up, and in his haste dropped the lantern, and the cave turned into darkness. He felt along the wall, trying to find a side passage, anything to turn around, and finally he did, backed up, turned around, and began the mad ascent back to the coffin. He could feel the little splinters of wood, pulled himself inside, pushed on the lid, and pushed. He couldn't imagine what was holding it shut, until he realized this was not the coffin by which he'd entered the catacombs. No, it was another he'd robbed of its occupant long ago and placed safely back beneath the earth, beneath dozens of inches of earth. And it was then that he heard the scrabble of little claws on dirt and the happy cries of rats smelling fresh meat. Well, the next day the village found the old woman's grave empty, but there was no sign of Mr. Masson. Perhaps he went mad. Perhaps he ran off to live like a king somewhere nice and warm. Or maybe something else occurred. But no matter. St. Timothy's Cemetery is looking for a new caretaker, if any of you should like to apply. I have one more story for you, a story of a beautiful little family from Cornwall. Now, they had a little house there by the sea and a beautiful daughter named Selina. And she loved the water. Her mother was always taking her down there to play and splash around in the waves. But one day, merriment nearly turned to tragedy when she got caught by a wave and pulled away from her mother. She began to frantically search the water for her, splashing about. She couldn't find her anywhere until suddenly Selina bobbed up in the arms of a mermaid. Well, no words were spoken, but there was a silent agreement they seemed to come to as she passed the child back to her mother. And from that day on, Selina was a little different. The dark brown eyes she'd been born with had now turned the color of the sea. Sometimes the bright blue of a summer sea, other times the blue-green of the cresting wave. And come a storm, her eyes were dark and stormy as the water she'd been rescued from. But the trauma of the event hadn't seemed to change her affection for the ocean whatsoever. Any time as the girl grew older, any time she wasn't doing her chores or work in town, you'd find her walking along the shore. And those with sharp eyes would see, away out on the horizon, another figure bobbing watching over her always. Well, it was on one of these walks when Selina met Walter Trelay. He was in town visiting his uncle, a wealthy squire nearby, and Selina thought Walter looked like a prince riding his white horse along the sands. Oh, and it seemed now every day that when she was out walking, Walter would come out riding, and he's always paying her some little compliment or other. She was quite moved by the attention that he gave her. And as the weeks passed, Selina thought that Walter was all that was good and kind, and Walter thought that Selina was a very pleasant way to pass the time until he went back to London. For he was rich and handsome and quite expected all young women to fall in love with him, and he didn't much care who it was, so long as he had some pretty companion wherever he was. So he courted Selina for a short time before growing bored and planning to head back to the glamours of London. But he was never one to burn bridges where pretty women were concerned, so he decided to let her down easy, took her for a walk along the cliffside there in Cornwall, and tell her that he'd be back soon, only a little time away, and then he'd be back to her. Oh, do you promise, Walter? I'll miss you. I do so love you. And he took her hands and got a little swept up in his own ruse and said, of course, I'll come back and then we'll be married. Oh, Selina was so happy. Oh, thinking of their future life together. She was as full of joy as Walter was filled with regret and panic. He didn't intend to marry a poor girl from Cornwall. He was trying to think, what could he do? What could he do to get out of this mess? Oh, she took him by the hand. She wanted to go directly home and tell her parents. And as he was feverishly thinking, there was suddenly a rumbling and a tumbling. There was a landslide. Bits of the cliff were falling away. Well, he dropped her hand and ran in the opposite direction, even as it was sweeping her away. And when at last the stones stopped falling, he went back. He looked over the edge and saw Selina clinging there desperately. Walter! Walter, help me, she called. And he looked down. He turned around and walked away. Perhaps it was the fall that killed her, or perhaps it was the water on the beach where she landed below. Walter didn't know. He was long gone by then. He didn't return to Cornwall for nearly a year, and when he did, he received no too warm a welcome. But his uncle's friends were throwing a grand party. It wasn't to be missed. He danced and caroused and had a wonderful time until around midnight. He started walking home along the shore. He'd had a bit too much to drink, and things looked so different at night, he started getting a little lost. And then he heard this woman's voice singing, come away, o'er the waters wide. And he followed that voice to the mouth of a cave where the moonlight shone off the water in iridescent shades of blue and green. And there in the cave on a rock sat a mermaid, and she was beckoning him closer. Well, he hesitated for just a moment, but then he thought, well, he'd won the heart of every woman on land. Why not a woman of the sea? And so he sat down beside her and started telling her how beautiful she was, and working all his usual charms. It certainly seemed to be working. She wrapped her arms around him and leaned in to whisper, I am Selina's guardian. I watched over her all these years. And he started to try to pull away, but her grip held fast. All these years keeping her safe until you came along. Lightning flashed, illuminating the cave, and he could see in the rising waters the flip of tails, the flash of moonlit hair, a dozen mermaids or more swarming around the rock, and together they began to sing. Come away, The tempest proud weaves a shroud for him who did betray. The water was growing higher and colder, his limbs ever more stiff against the mermaid's grasp, and it was then he began to feel things coming up out of the water, and they seemed to move in time with the song. Little crabs scurried up his legs. The tentacle of some unseen beast seized his wrists and held them fast. He screamed as little tendrils of seaweed began to wrap up around his body, his neck, over his face, finding every nook and cranny. And then the screaming stopped. No one ever saw Walter Trelay again. But they say in Cornwall, in a certain cave, there's a stone that, though covered in barnacles and seaweed now, bears a curious resemblance to a man drowning as the tide comes in. And on moonlit nights, they do say, you can sometimes hear away off in the distance voices singing, come away, within the cave lies a grave, for him we slay. Him we slay. Thank you, everybody. It was really fun. Thank you.
Oh, wow. That was great, Sarah. I'm just, I don't know whether I should laugh a little bit or just shake. I tell you, I'm not going to walk on the beach at night for a while, that's for sure. Thank you very much, Sarah. I just thoroughly enjoyed those 4 stories. And we do hope we have you come again and tell some more stories. Those were just great.
Oh, I'd love that. Thank you.
I'm going to now introduce Larry. Larry Hohm has been a long time part of the Seattle Storytellers Guild, and he really doesn't talk a lot about himself. He's recently retired as a software, I guess you would call him an engineer or developer or something like that. He lives on way up in the sky in Seattle. On what floor is it?
21st floor.
21st floor, one of those buildings in Seattle. He's up there with all those cranes and that. He's the man who put together and manages the Guild's website. But he's also known to tell stories, and especially he likes literary stories, of which he has memorized quite a few. If you look at his website, he's got a list of all these stories. He knows them all by heart, and he tells them all word for word without any notes. And you wouldn't really know that he was reciting a story because he's so good at presenting them. But as he tells these stories, I mean, he also done some live ones. And recently he told stories at 18th and Union, just a couple weeks ago. And he also told stories at the Swedish Club. October is his month. Obviously, the kind of dark stories he tells fit very well into October. And he's also got a number of stories on his website, and I'll be putting the link in the chat for that. But we do want to welcome Larry. And as I mentioned, for most of you heard that he has some vocabulary in the chat, on a link in the chat for one of his stories, which the vocabulary might be a little bit unfamiliar. In the one story, The Funeral by Richard Matheson. But Larry, we want to welcome you, and we look forward to hearing your stories. And so I guess it's all yours.
Thank you. Thank you for that warm introduction. And I want to thank Sarah. Those were some creepy stories. Yikes. And I like to tell creepy stories myself. Many of you know me. You know that I love to tell dark stories. But I'm not going to do that tonight. I'm going to try some humor instead. I don't tell a lot of humor, but I'm going to give it a shot. I hope that decision doesn't come back to haunt me. I promise. That was my only joke of the evening. I'm going to tell a story by Richard Matheson. It was published in 1955, entitled The Funeral. As mentioned, as Barry alluded to, this story contains over a dozen words that I was unfamiliar with when I first read the story. I had to look them up. And so I put together a list that and a link to that list that you can look at. I hope you've had a chance to look at some of them. I'll mention two of the terms before I start. I won't go through the whole list because many of these words you can figure out from the context. But there are two that occur early on that I want to mention to help us get started. One is obsequies. Obsequies are funeral rites. The other term is catafalque. A catafalque is a decorative platform often used in a funeral parlor to support the casket. And I promise, those are not spoilers. So, The Funeral by Richard Matheson. Morton Silkline was in his office musing over floral arrangements for upcoming obsequies. His thoughts were interrupted by the chiming strains of "I'm crossing o'er the bar to join the choir invisible." These chimes announced someone entering Clooney's cut-rate catafalque. Blinking his liver-colored eyes, Silkline knit his fingers to a placid clasp and then settled back against the sable leather of his chair, a smile of funereal welcome on his lips. Out in the stillness of the hallway, footsteps approached along the muffling carpet, moving at a leisured pace. Just before the tall man entered, the desk clock buzzed an acknowledgement to 7:30. Morton Silkline rose to his feet, as if caught in the midst of a tete-a-tete with death's angel. He circled the glossy desk and extended one flaccid-fingered hand. "Ah, good evening, sir," he soothed. His smile, a precise compendium of sympathy and welcome. His voice, a calculated drip of obeisance. The man's handshake was cool and bone-cracking, but Silkline managed to confine his reaction to a momentary flicker of agony in his cinnamon eyes. "Won't you be seated?" he murmured, fluttering his bruised hand toward the grieved one's chair. "Thank you," said the man as he seated himself. His voice, a polite baritone. He unbuttoned the front of his velvet-collared overcoat and placed his dark Homburg on the glass top of the desk. "My name is Morton Silkline," offered Silkline as he returned to his chair and settled on the cushion like a diffident butterfly. "Asper," said the man. "May I say that I am proud to meet you, Mr. Asper," Silkline purred. "Thank you," said the man. "Now then," continued Silkline, getting down to the business of bereavement, "what can Clooney's do to ease your sorrow?" The man crossed his dark-trousered legs. "I should like to make arrangements for a funeral service." Silkline nodded once with a "I am here to succor" smile. "Of course, sir, you have come to the right place." His gaze elevated a few inches. "When loved ones lie upon that lonely couch of everlasting sleep," he recited, "let Clooney draw the coverlet." His gaze returned, and he smiled with a modest subservience. "Mrs. Clooney made that up. We like to pass it along to those who come to us for comfort." "Very nice," said the tall man. "Extremely poetic. But to details. I would like to engage your largest parlor." "I see," said Silkline, restraining himself, but only with effort, from rubbing his hands together. "That would be our eternal rest room." "Fine," said the man. "And I would also like to buy your most expensive casket." Silkline could barely restrain a boyish grin. his cardiac muscle flexing vigorously. He tried his best to hide the folds of sorrowful solicitude on his face. I'm sure that can be affected. With gold trimmings? Asked the man. Why, yes, said Director Silkline, clicking audibly as he swallowed. I'm sure that Clooney's can satisfy your every need during this time of grievous loss. Then his voice slipped from the condoling to the fiduciary. Naturally, it will entail a bit more expenditure than would otherwise be. The cost is of no importance, said the man, waving it away. I want only the best of everything. It will be so, sir, it will be so, declared a fervent Morton Silkline. Capital, said the man. Silkline went on briskly. Now, should you be wishing our Mr. Mossmound to deliver his sermon on crossing the Great Divide? I think not, said the man, shaking his head thoughtfully. A friend of mine will speak at the service. Silkline nodded. Ah, I see. Reaching forward, he plucked the gold pen from its onyx holder. Then with 2 fingers of his left hand, he carefully drew out an application form from the ivory box on his desk. He looked up with the accredited expression for the asking of painful questions. And what is the name of the deceased, may I ask? Asper, said the man. Silkline glanced up, smiling politely. A relative? Me, said the man. Silkline's laugh was a faint coughing. I beg your pardon. I thought you said me, repeated the man. But I don't, you see, explained the man. I never had a proper going off. It was catch as catch can, you might say, all improvised. Nothing, how shall I put it, tasty. I always regretted that. I always intended to make up for it. Morton Silkline returned the pen to its holder with a decisive jabbing of his hand. He rose to his feet, pulsing with a harsh distemper. Indeed, sir, indeed. The man looked surprised at the vexation of Morton Silkline, and he started to speak. But Silkline interrupted. I am as fully prepared as the next fellow for trifling banter. But not during business hours. I think you fail to realize, sir, just where you are. This is Clooney's, a much respected ossuary, not a place for trivial joking or... Pausing in mid-sentence, Silkline shrank back and stared with open mouth at the tall man who was suddenly on his feet, his eyes glittering with a light most unseemly. This is not a joke, he said balefully. I came here with the most serious purpose in mind. His eyes were glowing now like cherry-bright coals, and I expect this purpose to be gratified. Do you understand? Silkline started to speak. The tall man continued. On Tuesday next at 8:30 p.m., my friends and I will arrive here for the service. You will have everything prepared by then. Full payments will be made directly following the ceremony. Are there any questions? Again, Silkline started. Again, the tall man continued. I need hardly remind you that this matter is of the utmost importance to me. He picked up his Homburg and paused potently. His voice sank to a forbidding basso profundo. I expect all to go well. Bowing slightly at the waist, he crossed the office in 2 regal strides, pausing for a moment at the door. Oh, one additional item. That mirror in the foyer? Remove it. And I might add any others that my friends and I might chance upon during our stay in your parlors. He raised one gray-gloved hand. And now, good night. When Silkline reached the hallway, his customer was just flapping out of a small window. Quite suddenly, Morton Silkline found the floor. They arrived promptly at 8:30, conversing as they entered the foyer. They were met by Director Silkline, his legs shaking, his eyes ringed by the raccoon circles of sleepless nights. "Good evening," greeted the tall man, noting, with a pleased nod, the absence of the mirror on the wall. Silkline tried to reply, but his vocal cords went slack as his dazed eyes moved from figure to figure in the tall man's entourage. The gnarl-faced hunchback, whom Silkline heard addressed as Igor, the peak-hatted crone with a black cat crouched on her shoulder, the hulking, hairy-handed man who clicked his yellow teeth together and regarded Silkline with markedly more than casual eyes, the waxen-featured little man who licked his lips and smiled at Silkline as though he possessed some inner satisfaction, and the half-dozen men and women in evening dress, all cherry-eyed and, Silkline cringed, superbly toothed. Silkline hung against the wall, his mouth a circular entranceway, his hands twitching feebly at his sides. He remained motionless as the chatting assemblage passed him by, heading for the eternal rest room. "Please join us," said the tall man. Silkline stirred fitfully from the wall and wove an erratic path down the hall. His eyes still saucer around with stupor. The tall man said pleasantly, "I trust everything is well prepared." Silkline squeaked, Oh, yes." "Sterling," said the man. When the two of them opened the door, the others were grouped in a semicircle, admiring the casket. "Is good," mumbled the hunchback to himself. "Is good box." The ancient crone stroked her cat and cackled, "Aye, be that a casket or be that a casket, Delphinia?" Delphinia replied, "Meow." The others nodded with felicitous smiles and murmured, "Ah, ah." Then one of the women in evening dress said, "Let Ludwig see." And the semicircle split open so the tall man could pass. He ran his long fingers over the gold trim on the sides and the top of the casket, nodding appreciatively. "Splendid," he said, his voice husky with emotion. "Quite splendid. Just what I always wanted." "You picked a beauty, lad," said a tall, well-dressed gentleman. "Well, try it on for size," declared the chuckling crone. So, with a boyish smile, Ludwig climbed into the casket, wriggled into place. "A perfect fit," he said with contentment. "Master, look good," mumbled Igor. "Look good in box." Then the hairy-handed man demanded they begin, because he had an appointment at 9:15. So they all hurried to their chairs. "Come, duck," said the crone, waving a scrawny hand at the ossified Silkline. "Sit by my side. I likes the pretty boys, I do. Eh, Delphinia?" Delphinia said, "Meow." "Please, Jenny," pleaded Ludwig, opening his eyes for a moment. "I'm serious. You know what this means to me." The crone muttered, "Aye, aye." Then took off her peaky hat as the zombie-stiff Silkline quivered into place beside her, aided by the guiding hand of the waxen-faced little man. "Hello, pretty boy," whispered the crone, leaning over and jabbing a spear-point elbow into Silkline's ribs. Then the tall, white-haired gentleman from Carpathia rose to his feet, and the service began. Good friends, we are gathered ourselves within these walls to pay homage to our comrade, Ludwig Asper, whom the pious and unyielding fates have chosen to pluck from existence and place within that bleak sarcophagus of all eternity. "Sais-je?" someone murmured. "Change de signe," said another. Igor wept. The waxen-featured little man sitting on the other side of Morton Silkline leaned over to murmur, "Tasty." But Silkline wasn't sure it was in reference to the funeral address. The gentleman from Carpathia continued, "And thus we collect our bitter selves about this, our comrade's beer, about this litter of sorrow, this Carn, this cromlech, this unhappy tumulus." "Clearer, clearer," demanded Jenny, stamping one petulant shoe. "Row," said Delphinia. The crone winked one blood-laced eye at Silkline, who shrank away, only to brush against the little man, who gazed at him with beery eyes and murmured once again, "Tasty." The white-haired gentleman paused long enough to gaze down his royal nose at the crone. Then he continued, "This mastaba, this sorrowing taupe, this got, this dread dogma." "What did he say?" asked Igor. The crone declared, "This ain't no declamation, Turney. Keep it crisp, I say." Ludwig raised his head again, a look of pained embarrassment on his face. "Jenny, please." The crone snapped, "Ah, toad's teeth." The Count went on testily, "Rest in peace, dear brother. The memory of you shall not perish with your untimely sepulture. You are, dear friend, not so much out of the game as playing on another field." At which the hairy-handed man rose and hulked from the room with the guttural announcement, "Must go." Silkline felt an icy chill as he heard the sudden padding of clawed feet in the hallway and a howling which echoed back along the walls. The little man whispered with a bright-eyed smile, "Owlgate says he has a dinner appointment." Silkline was shuddering. The Count stood tall and silent, his red eyes shut, his mouth tight-lipped with aristocratic pique. "Count," pleaded Ludwig, "please." "Am I to endure these vulgar calumnies?" asked the Count. "Well, la-dee-da," crooned Jenny to her cat. "Silence, woman!" roared the Count, his head disappearing for a moment in a white vapor, then reappearing as he gained control. Ludwig sat up, his face a twist of aggravation. "Jenny, I think you'd better leave." "You think to throw out old Jenny?" challenged the crone. "Well, you gotta think that's coming then." She slapped on her pointed hat, and then, as a shriveling Silkline watched, lightning sprouted from her fingertips. Delphinia bristled ebony hairs. The Count stepped forward, hand outstretched to clamp onto the crone's shoulder. Then he stiffened in mid-stride as he found himself ringed by sizzling fire. "Ha!" crowed Jenny as a horrified Silkline gagged. "My rug!" "Jenny!" cried Ludwig, clambering out of the casket. The crone gestured, and all the flowers in the room began exploding like popcorn. "No," moaned Silkline as the curtains flared and split. Chairs were overthrown. The Count transformed into a hissing stream of white carpeted, which flew at Jenny. Jenny flung her arms and vanished in an orange froth, cat and all, as the air grew thick with winged flapping. Just before Morton Silkline toppled forward, the waxen-faced little man leaned over. Smiling toothfully, he squeezed the director's arm and murmured, "Tasty." Then Silkline was at one with the rug. Morton Silkline slumped in his sable leather chair, still twitching slightly, even though a week had passed since the nerve-splitting event. On his desk lay the note that Ludwig Asper had left pinned to his chest while he was unconscious. "Sir," it read, "accept this bag of gold, which I trust will cover all costs. In addition, Please accept my regrets that full decorum was not affected by the guests at my funeral. Save for that, the entire preparation was most satisfactory. Silkline put down the note and lovingly touched the hill of glinting coins on his desk. Through judicious inquiry, he had learned of a family connection in Mexico, a cosmetician cousin in Carrillo's cut-rate catacomb. He learned that his cousin could safely dispose of the gold at mutual profit. All things considered, the affair had not really been as bad as all. Silkline looked up as something entered his office. He would have chosen to leap back screaming and vanish into the flowered pattern of the wallpaper, but he was too petrified. Once more gape-mouthed, he stared at the huge, ochre-dripping, tentacled shapelessness that weaved and swayed before him. It spoke politely. "A friend recommended you to me." Silkline sat bug-eyed for a long moment. Then he accidentally touched the mountain of gold on his desk, and he found strength. Breathing through his mouth, he said, "You have come to the right place, sir." He swallowed mightily and braced himself. Then he reached for his gold pen, blowing away the yellow-green smoke, which was beginning to obscure the office. "And what is the name of the deceased, may I ask?" "Thank you. Thank you very much."
Oh, Larry, I tell you, that was a good one. I mean, and you did such a great job of keeping us up on all the people that were in that funeral ceremony. I mean, tell you, I don't think I've had much fun since Abbott and Costello met Frankenstein. uh, I have
that was rich.
I encourage you all to switch back to gallery view, and you can now unmute yourselves and offer your congratulations to Sarah and to Larry. And in a moment, after you get a chance to say a few things, I'll share a few announcements.
Thank you, Larry, and thank you, Sarah. I don't remember a Halloween or a near Halloween concert that had so many stomach-churning, horrifying laughs as this. Amazing, amazingly well told, and amazing choices of stories. Thank you so, so much.
I agree. Thank you.
Great fun. Oh my goodness. Larry, you are just incredible. I don't know how you do that. All those different people were right in the room with you, or all those different creatures. I just, woo. But you managed to keep it going, and I was totally into who was where and who was saying what and what their character was, and oh my, that was great.
Thank you.
All those characters were in the Zoom with us.
Yes, they were. That's right, Joy. All of them were in the Zoom with us.
I thought it interesting that there was a Martin in Sarah's story and also in yours, Larry. This is Martin's night.
Yeah, that was Richard Matheson. He's a very clever writer, very prolific writer. I have to track down more of his stories.
Yeah. And Sarah, just to tell one story after another perfectly without a pause was totally amazing.
Oh, well, thank you. I'm really glad you enjoyed them. Thank you.
Yeah, I love the expression of your face and also your gestures. I have put a few